They didn't speak her name when they gave her away, just called her the girl with the sharp tongue and shoved her forward like an unwanted calf. Miriam stood silent, spine straight, fists clenched at her sides as her uncle bartered with the passing Lakota band. Her father had died 2 winters prior, and with her mother gone from fever, Miriam had been a burden no one wanted to carry. The man who finally stepped forward from the Lakota didn't look at her like an animal or a joke. He looked like he was measuring her strength. He was tall and lean, with quiet eyes, and a long scar that curved under his jaw like a river bend. They called him Tahu, which she would later learn meant daylight, though his expression held the gravity of dusk. Without saying a word, he nodded once to her uncle, gave over a single beaded knife, and walked away, expecting her to follow. No one had asked if she agreed. No one ever did. But she followed, because what else could she do? Sleep in the barn with the hogs again? Starve through winter while they blamed her for eating too much? Her boots sank in the dust with every step, but her gaze never dropped. They walked far without speaking. When they reached the camp, he offered her a blanket and sat a bowl of hot stew in front of her. She flinched when he came near, not because she feared him, but because she'd been taught to fear everyone. He noticed. Instead of touching her, he knelt beside the fire and whittled a piece of wood, slow and patient, as if his presence beside her didn't mean ownership, but protection. That night, she lay awake on a mat of furs, staring at the stars above the hide-covered tent, waiting for the worst. But it didn't come. No harsh words, no hands grabbing what wasn't freely given. Just silence, just the rustle of wind through pines and the occasional crack of embers shifting. She realized something then. Tahu had paid for her, but not like a man claiming property. He'd traded for her the way one saves a life. And though he hadn't said a word, the way he laid her food gently beside her, how he looked away when she dressed for bed, spoke more than any sermon she'd ever heard. For the first time in her life, Miriam wasn't bracing for cruelty. She was bracing for something scarier, the possibility of kindness. Miriam rose before the sun, instinct pressing her to do chores she hadn't been asked to do. In her uncle's house, any moment of stillness had been an invitation for punishment, so she busied herself, folding the bedding, sweeping the ground around the fire, wiping out the stew pot. Tahu watched her from where he crouched near the horses, sharpening a blade with calm precision. He didn't speak, didn't correct her, didn't bark out instructions the way men usually did. And that unsettled her more than anything else. As the morning warmed, she wandered near the edge of the camp, not far enough to seem ungrateful, but just enough to breathe. A few Lakota women passed her, nodding softly, eyes curious but not unkind. One of them, a girl no older than herself with braids like black silk and arms strong from work, handed her a strip of jerky and smiled. Miriam hadn't eaten with women in years, not without being sneered at or told to wait. She bit into the meat slowly, not realizing how much she missed being seen as human. That afternoon, she helped grind corn, watching how the others moved, how they joked gently and touched one another without flinching. When she dropped the stone pestle by accident, her whole body tensed, waiting for the slap or insult. It never came. The women merely chuckled and showed her again. And when she looked up to find Tahu watching from across the camp, he didn't wear a smirk or a scowl, just quiet approval. That night, she returned to his fire and found the wooden carving he'd been shaping yesterday now shaped like a hawk. It sat on the blanket she'd used, delicate and strong. She picked it up, felt the grooves he'd carved with such care. He said nothing as she held it, but something about the weight of it in her palm felt like a promise. Days passed like this. She kept waiting for the turn, for the slap, the command, the reminder that she was just a traded thing. But it didn't come. One morning, as she finished mending a tear in his shirt, she finally asked, "Why haven't you touched me?" He blinked slowly, then said, "Because no one ever should unless you ask them to." Her breath caught. It was the first time he'd spoken to her. And in that single sentence, he gave her more freedom than any family had in her whole life. Miriam kept the wooden hawk beside her sleeping furs, turning it over in her hand at night like a prayer. She didn't know what it meant yet, only that Tahu had carved it, and he didn't seem the kind of man to do anything without reason. One evening, as the sky burned orange and smoke from cooking fires curled like silk into the air, she sat beside him and finally asked, "Why a hawk?" He didn't answer right away. He rarely did. But when he did speak, his voice was low and even, as if it belonged more to the wind than to any man. "Hawks do not ask to be caged," he said, "but they come back if you treat them well." Her throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her in metaphor before, let alone made her feel like she might be something strong. Most of her life, she'd been compared to goats, chores, burdens. Now she was a bird in someone's eyes. A few nights later, she saw him return from a hunt with blood on his shoulder and a limp in his walk. Her heart thudded with panic, though she didn't understand why. He sat without complaint, wincing only slightly as he dropped a rabbit onto the firestones. She fetched water, washed his cut, tore part of her shawl to bind it. "You should have told me," she said, voice trembling. "You help me," he replied simply. "Now I help you. That is what people do when they are not afraid of each other." She didn't reply. Couldn't. Her hands were still shaking. The scar beneath his jaw. It caught the firelight, and for the first time she asked, "How did you get that?" He looked at her, really looked, and said, "Protecting someone who had no one else." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. That night, as she lay awake again, the quiet wasn't so frightening anymore. It was deep and safe, like the sound of river water under stars, and the space between her and Tahu, once wide with distrust, now felt full of something unspoken, something not quite love, not quite obligation. Just understanding. Miriam found herself thinking things she hadn't allowed in years. Could a woman like her, unwanted, cast off, silenced, truly be seen? Could a man who barely spoke actually hear her better than anyone ever had? When she finally closed her eyes, she dreamed not of escape, but of wings. Hawks circling, free, and always returning. The storm rolled in fast, black clouds swirling over the hills like they were chasing something wicked. Miriam rushed to help the women tie down the hides, while children scurried to gather firewood and blankets. She had learned quickly how to move like she belonged, even if a part of her still waited for someone to push her away. When the first drops fell, fat and cold, she ducked beneath Tahu's shelter, shivering from the sudden chill. He was there, already tending to a small fire inside, the light dancing across his steady hands. Without a word, he handed her a dry shawl, hers now, not borrowed. "Thank you," she said softly, fingers brushing his. He didn't pull away. Outside, thunder cracked, and the wind screamed, but inside that small tent, it felt like the world had paused. As the night wore on, the wind grew cruel. The fire snapped. Tahu moved closer to block the draft, settling beside her without touching, without demanding. It would have been so easy, Miriam thought, for him to take what he'd been given by trade. No one would have stopped him. But Tahu never treated her like something taken. He treated her like something worth waiting for. When lightning flashed and a child cried nearby, Miriam flinched, Her old life rose like smoke, memories of being scolded for shivering, mocked for whimpering, her stepmother's voice snarling, "Cry louder and I'll give you a reason." But Tahu's voice was low, calm, grounding. "It's just sky reminding the earth it still has a voice," he said. That strange poetry of his again. And somehow it worked. She looked at him through strands of wet hair and said, "You speak like you know how to listen." His lips quirked, not quite a smile, but close. "You can't heal anything if you don't listen first." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of warmth, of safety, of things neither of them had the words for yet. When she finally laid her head against his shoulder, it wasn't out of need, it was choice. The fire hissed, the storm howled, and Tahu reached up slowly to tuck the shawl tighter around her. That was all. No possession, no heat of hunger, just care. And Miriam, for the first time in her memory, felt not only protected, but seen. Not as a problem, not as a mouth to feed, not even as a wife, but as a person who mattered, who might even someday be loved. It was during the gathering of wild mint that one of the older Lakota women asked Miriam what her name meant. She hesitated, unsure how to explain something that had never meant anything to anyone before. "My father picked it from the Bible," she said finally, voice soft. "Said it sounded proper." The woman, called Awanji, nodded but didn't smile. "What do you want it to mean?" Miriam blinked. No one had ever asked her that before. Her name had always felt like a tag tied to her collar. Cold, distant, chosen by someone else. That night she found herself thinking about it as she sat beside Tahu, the fire between them crackling low. "Do you think a name can change?" she asked. He looked at her thoughtfully. "Names are only promises," he said. "They change when the promise changes." She tilted her head. "And what would you name me if it were your choice?" Tahu didn't answer right away. He reached for his carving tools instead, and by the time she woke the next morning, a small piece of ashwood sat beside her bedroll. It was a bird again. Not a hawk this time, but a dove, wings tucked, resting in the curve of a hand. "Wiaka," he said when she held it up, repeating the Lakota word slowly. It means feather, or peace, if spoken in the right way. Her throat tightened. "Why that?" "Because you were dropped into the wind, but you did not break." She couldn't speak after that. Could only hold the carving close and feel something inside her chest shift, like a door she'd forgotten had been bolted for years was finally creaking open. That day, she wore her hair in braids for the first time, a quiet tribute to the women who'd welcomed her into their rhythms. She helped gather firewood, told stories to the children, and laughed, really laughed, when one of them threw a handful of wildflowers at her in jest. And Tahu, always quiet, watched with eyes that held something deeper than affection. He looked at her like she was becoming. That night she placed the dove carving beside the hawk. 2 pieces of wood, 2 names. One for the fire in her, and one for the softness she'd buried so long ago. She was still Miriam, yes. But she was also Wiaka now, a girl who had survived shame, cruelty, and silence, only to find that maybe, just maybe, the world still had room for her to unfold. It was near sundown when the rider appeared, a white man with a red beard and eyes like cold water, leading a mule heavy with supplies. He came with pelts to trade, nodding politely, but keeping his gaze too long on the women. Miriam felt it like a stone in her gut. Tahu noticed, too. His shoulders stiffened, and his fingers rested on the handle of his knife, not threatening, just prepared. The trader smiled too wide when he spotted Miriam. "Didn't expect to see one of ours in a place like this," he said with a smirk, as if she were some runaway servant. Miriam didn't answer, didn't move. But Tahu stepped between them without a word. The trader raised his palms. No harm meant. Just surprised a girl like her ended up with, well, you folk. He chuckled like he was being clever. A few of the other Lakota men moved closer. Awanji hissed something under her breath. Miriam wanted to shrink, to vanish, but instead something in her hardened. I'm not a girl like her anymore, she said, lifting her chin. I'm where I choose to be. The man blinked, as if slapped. Tahu didn't say a word, didn't gloat, didn't grin. He simply stood by her, quiet and still, letting her speak for herself. The trader coughed, muttered something about the weather, and finished his business quickly. He didn't look at Miriam again. That night, around the fire, no one spoke of the encounter. But when Tahu handed her a fresh strip of hide with new beads sewn into it, red, blue, and white, he said quietly, "You spoke like a hawk." She looked down at the beadwork. It wasn't fancy, but it was shaped in the form of wings. She didn't need more words. His respect had never come in grand gestures. It came in how he let her be herself, in how he stood beside her, not in front, in how he let her past remain her own. That night, she tied the beaded strip around her wrist like armor, not to hide the girl she'd been, but to honor the woman she was becoming. The one who could stare down a man and not tremble. The one who was no longer someone to be bartered, silenced, or pitied. She had a place now, a name, a voice, and a man who knew how to let her rise. The celebration came with the first frost, when meat had been smoked, herbs dried, and winter stores safely tucked away. Drums echoed across the plain, children painted with clay stripes darted through the tents, and the scent of wild sage and roasted corn filled the air. Miriam had never known a night like it. She wore a shawl gifted by Awanji, woven with crimson threads and lined in soft rabbit fur. The women had braided her hair with river shells and laughed when she blushed from the attention. Tonight, they said, you dance. And when the drums began, her feet moved before she knew they'd answered the call. She danced not to please anyone, not to beg for love or prove her worth. She danced because her body remembered joy, because the ground felt like hers now, because Tahu was watching, silent as always, but with pride in his eyes that said she had become something sacred. When the music slowed, she stepped from the circle to catch her breath, and found herself face to face with a woman she'd never seen before. Older, dressed in settler rags, sunburned and tight-jawed. "You're the one who was traded," the woman said, almost accusing. "You were that niece of Reuben Clark. My cousin knew him." Miriam stood still, breath-catching. She hadn't heard her old name in months. The woman sneered. "He said you were mouthy, said no man would take you. Looks like you finally got desperate." The words hit like stones, but they didn't land the same way anymore. Miriam looked past the woman at the fire, at the faces who had welcomed her, at Tahu standing just far enough to let her handle it. She stepped closer, voice steady. "He was right about one thing," she said. "No man wanted me, but a warrior chose me, and I chose him back." The woman blinked, thrown. "This isn't your place," she snapped. Miriam's smile came slow, calm, full of something fierce. "Then why does it feel more like home than any room he ever put me in?" She turned and walked away without waiting for an answer. That night, as the fire cracked and the stars returned, Tahu pressed a warm bowl of stew into her hands. "You didn't burn," he said, eyes soft. "You became flame." She rested her head lightly against his shoulder, and for the first time, felt like nothing about her needed to be hidden. Not even the fire, The cold deepened. Snow crept down from the mountains and kissed the edges of the village. Fires burned longer, and voices grew softer with the hush of winter settling in. Miriam helped sow furs and grind dried roots, her hands quick now, her fingers sure. She no longer flinched when someone called her name, because here, Wiaka was said with respect. One evening, as she left the cook fire, she found a thick buffalo blanket folded outside Tahu's shelter. Her breath caught. She recognized the pattern. Black zigzags across crimson and gold. It was a gift of protection, given by those who wanted someone kept warm, safe, and close. Inside, Tahu sat with his hands clasped, as if unsure of his own offering. She stepped in quietly and laid the blanket over both their shoulders. "You want me here?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Not just near. Here." Tahu didn't answer with words. Instead, he touched her face with the gentleness of someone who knew what bruises felt like. His thumb brushed the curve of her jaw like he was remembering her, not discovering her. "No man ever asked me," she whispered. "Not if I wanted. Not what I feared. They just took." "Then let me be the one who waits," he said, "until you no longer flinch." She didn't cry. She had shed enough tears for the past. Instead, she leaned into him, and they sat there, blanketed by warmth, silence, and something deeper than either could name. That night, no rush, no fire of urgency, just stillness and the slow opening of trust. He didn't reach for more. He didn't push. He simply gave her space to breathe, to belong, to rest her cheek against the heartbeat of a man who had never raised his voice, never raised his hand. For hours, they didn't move. She thought of the girl she'd been, the one given away like a problem, bartered like a sack of flour. And now, here she was, wrapped in a warrior's care, not owned, not used, chosen, seen, cherished. As sleep drifted over her, Miriam realized something powerful. Love wasn't loud. It wasn't a promise shouted over a wedding altar. It was quiet, patient. The way a blanket holds warmth, the way two hands rest side by side, the way one man had waited, not for her body, but for her trust. And finally, she'd given it freely. Spring arrived early that year, brushing green across the plains and loosening the rivers from their icy grip. Miriam had begun teaching the younger girls to braid in 3-strand patterns, and laughter came easier these days. But peace, as she had learned, always comes with a test. He rode into camp at midday, dust-covered and sour-eyed, her cousin Reuben Clark's son, Jonah, the same boy who had once called her Dog-Face and stolen her shoes for fun. Now he wore a preacher's coat and sat high in the saddle like the past had forgiven him. "I'm here for the girl my kin gave away," he announced, eyes combing the village until they found her. "You don't belong here, Miriam. Come home. You've made your point." Tahu stood beside her before she could speak, but Miriam placed a hand on his arm. She didn't need defense. Not anymore. "You mean the home where I was starved and laughed at? Where I was traded like livestock?" Her voice was calm, clear. Jonah shifted uncomfortably. "That was before. You've made a spectacle of yourself now. We can give you a place again. A proper one." "And what would I be there?" she asked. "A servant in someone's attic? A reminder of a shame you all pretended not to see?" Jonah frowned. "This life you've made here, it's not Christian." Miriam stepped forward. "This life is honest. I've been treated with more grace among strangers than I ever was by blood." Behind her, the tribe had gathered, silent but present. No weapons drawn, just eyes watching, trusting her. Tahu didn't move, didn't interrupt. He let her choose her words, her path. Jonah scoffed. "You think this savage has made you a wife?" She smiled then, not bitter, not angry, just certain. He's made me human. Jonah tried once more. We can undo this mistake. No, she said. You already did, when you gave me away. With that, she turned. She walked back into the heart of the village without looking over her shoulder. And Jonah, for all his bluster, didn't follow. That evening, Tahu sat with her under a willow tree. You did not need me, he said quietly, but I needed to stand beside you anyway. Miriam leaned into his warmth. You didn't stand beside me because I was weak. You did it because you saw I was strong. The past had returned, and she had faced it, not as the girl who had been thrown away, but as the woman who had been reclaimed. By the time the summer winds swept through the plains, Miriam's hands had built more than fires and meals. She had built trust and warmth, and something even more sacred, belonging. The village had grown to know her as more than just the girl who was once given away. She was Wiaka now, the one who stitched strong seams, who taught songs to the littlest ones, who stood between silence and shame and turned both into strength. On the day the final pole of their new lodge was raised, she stood beside Tahu in the center, barefoot on the fresh earth. It wasn't a grand home, but every stone, every pelt, every carved beam held her fingerprints. She had built a life from nothing, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she owed it to anyone. No man had rescued her. No savior had swept in. She had chosen her path, spoken her truth, and been loved not despite her wounds, but because of how she had healed around them. That evening, as the sky turned amber and drums welcomed the sunset, Tahu knelt before her, not with a ring or a ceremony, but with a small bundle wrapped in buckskin. She opened it slowly. Inside was the dove carving, and beside it a new piece, a hawk and dove, wings entwined. 2 names, 1 future. She looked at him, eyes brimming. You never asked me to stay, she whispered. You never made me feel I had to. Because this was never a debt, he said, only a choice, one you made every day. Tears slipped free, warm against her cheeks. She kissed him then, not out of desperation or fear, but as a woman who knew her worth and saw it reflected in his eyes. Around them, the village cheered softly. Awanji lit the first fire in their new home, murmuring a blessing. And as the smoke rose gently into the dusk, Miriam turned her face to the stars. She had no father to give her away now, no man to barter her future, no shame she had to outgrow. She had walked through the fire, and it had not burned her. It had refined her. And now, beneath a roof she helped raise, beside a man who never claimed to own her, Miriam finally knew what it meant to be home. Not where you're placed, not where you're sent, but where you're seen and loved on your own terms. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had seen her there, would you have stepped in too? Tell us in the comments.